The Judgement by Terry Daniels. Introduction. The human brain is a rare, complicated and precious thing. It has been compared to the deepest of oceans and the widest of plains. Its power is seemingly infinite. Its whole structure and reasoning remains beyond any scientific thinking. The true purpose of any brain, though, comes at the end, the very end. Indeed, in a split second, a person's whole life is judged and decided before it either continues or implodes and shuts down, beyond revival. That split second becomes a course of trial, an assessment and judgment, the dying second that determines a life or death sentence. Chapter 1. Sarah and Teddy. Another bright morning. The sun edged ominously around the grey full-length curtains that, although classed as blackout, allowed a small strip of light to infiltrate into the bedroom of local nurse Sarah Pascoe. It was 7:30 on a midweek morning, and the alarm was due to shrill its retro sound, but Sarah was already awake and ready for it. A naturally early riser, one of the small privileges in her life was to be able to lie awake in the security and warmth of the spacious double bed thoughtfully left behind by her ex-boyfriend, who was now living 200 miles away in a central England town with someone else. As the alarm began its unnatural tinny bell, her hand reached out from the quilt and silenced it with a satisfying click. She always trusted herself on waking at the correct time in the morning, but at the same time wanted the backup of this analogue clock just in case. The clock itself was an old-fashioned wind-up with a luminous face, round in shape with 4 little metal legs to prevent it from rolling off the bedside table. It was similar, if not an exact replica, of the model her parents had owned. Sarah had picked it up from a local boot fair some months ago and had been rather pleased with the find. In a funny way, it always reminded her of her childhood to hear that clockwork tick she found so soothing. Very rarely did it have the chance to actually sound, as Sarah was always there to prevent it. She was now a non-drinker, and her days of waking in a haze of alcohol and a thumping brain, due to a very late night, were long gone. Her last boyfriend had drank beer most nights back then, until crawling in beside her and proceeded to snore his way through till morning. It was very off-putting, and had also made her miserable and late for work. The sex was dull, and the rows were plentiful. That was why she was back living alone. She was now always very happy, and she loved her new job. Her flat was a simple affair. It was rented through a local firm, and the owner had known Sarah since she was a little girl, so any problems with damp or electric were swiftly dealt with. Since being on her own, Sarah had found that she had relished her own company. There were no manic days of tidying up after boyfriends, or trying to impress her friends with lavish, unappreciated meals. The flat had everything she needed currently in her life. It was on the first floor of a small block built very close to the harbour of the small Cornish village she was born in and had spent most of her life in. Virtually all the other flats were either occupied by retired couples or owned by city dwellers and bought as seasonal holiday apartments. She was happy here. She was happy with everything. Sarah Pascoe was 31. She often thought of herself as small at 5 foot 4 inches, but it suited her shape. She had blonde hair cut to her neckline and had never experimented with any other colour or style since her school days. She had 3 brothers, all older than her by 5 or 6 years. It was almost as though her mum and dad had been given son after son and then left it a few years. After being disappointed with the results, they had tried one more time. Then, at last, a baby girl. It probably never happened that way, but she was content with that version. Her mum was a devoted Christian, and Sundays were always the same. Porridge in the morning, followed by church service, then roast beef in the afternoon. That was always followed in the early evening with prayers before the tedious routine of preparing for school and the arduous week. As the boys approached puberty, they had started to discover that the lure and suggestiveness of the opposite sex was much more preferable to church and forgiveness, and much to the horror of their mother, had begun to spend most of Sunday morning in bed, waking only by the smell of the slow-cooked roast beef beginning to drift from the kitchen aga and rising into their bedrooms. Her father remained neutral to the rows around the dinner table and contented himself in carving the beef and keeping quiet. He knew his place in the family and wanted a quiet life. Religion to him mattered little in comparison to his wife. As he saw it, his wife was God. He was happy with that. Sarah regarded her parents' marital relationship as a traditional one. After 30 years together in sickness and in health, they had become a working unit of raising their children and mainly keeping out of each other's way. Mother had religion and a house, and father had his workplace and, upon retiring, his beloved allotment. When her brothers had stopped attending Sunday service, Sarah remained the dutiful daughter and accompanied her mother every Sunday. She felt within herself that her belief in God was real. She enjoyed the hymns, was bored by the monotonous sermons, but felt it was all worth it for the small gathering afterwards in the adjoining church hall, where tea and biscuits were served for those that wanted to stay a little longer after the service. This was put on by the vicar's wife and was designed to allow her husband's flock to gather and discuss the sermon of the day and current affairs affecting the church. What normally happened was an opportunity for scandalous gossip amongst the villagers, as well as a chance for the longer members of the community to hold on to some company and human contact that little longer before returning to their own solitude for the rest of the day. Sarah felt a little sorry for those people and was glad that she had a big family to live with. Everyone knew her mother and could always rely on information being relayed over. They would always refer to her as Darling Sarah, and she always made a point of remembering all of their names. Mrs. McCafferty was a long-term widower and a devout attendee, a small and frail lady who always complained of the cold, and the rough blue woolen coat she wore was the only thing that Sarah had ever seen her in. She was known to be constantly moaning, but her face would always light up when she saw Sarah. Miss Needy was more in the age range of Sarah's parents. In fact, Jessica Needy was an old school friend of her mother's. She ran the local post office by the harbour and had lived within a mile of the church all of her life. Many rumours had circulated as to why she had never married. Some of the others had even told Sarah, quite wickedly, that she was an old flame of her father's. On the occasion her dad had married her mother, Miss Needy had discovered her heart had been broken and had resigned herself to the life of a spinster. If any of this was true, Sarah was unsure. Her father always denied it, and her mother had regarded the story as pompous. As for Miss Needy, she was never a lady to tell tales. It never mattered to Sarah, who always enjoyed her company in the hour after sermon. Mr. Darget was more of a mystery, a recent addition, an outsider and an Englishman to boot. He resided at the care home at the harbour edge and was rumoured to be a reclusive millionaire. This, Sarah surmised, could have a small ring of truth, as the home itself was specialist in dementia care and rather expensive. The days of the community looking after itself had long since passed and been replaced by private companies buying up old stately homes for those that could afford to live the end of their days in luxury. For this, Mr. Darget was almost despised, but as a regular church attender it was tolerated. Goodness knows what was said about him out of earshot. Sarah liked him. He was almost like an old-fashioned English dapper from one of the black-and-white British films her parents watched. Quietly spoken, he had once told Sarah he was at the beginning stages of dementia after suffering a couple of small strokes, but had been advised to reside in the care home as a precaution. He had told her he had led a colourful and vibrant life, was enjoying his time in the small village, and mainly came to church to meet other local people. It was also to remove himself from all the bores at the care home while he was still agile enough to do so. He also insisted she call him Teddy. Although quietly spoken and a difference in age, they had got on very well. It made the going to church that little more enjoyable. One day Sarah had a surprise for him and told him that she had been accepted as a care nurse for the home by the harbour. She would be able to see more of him during the week. He was beside himself with happiness. Their conversations together at the after-service gatherings had been enjoyed by both. That had been 3 years ago. Sarah still worked and loved every minute at the home by the harbour. It was what she now lived for. Her life at the flat with no boyfriend anywhere in sight was a complete freedom she had never known before in her life. She still saw Teddy every day, but he stopped attending church some time ago since his dementia had worsened. With his mobility declining, Sarah now found she was looking after him more and more, and their long conversations had been greatly reduced. He began to forget her name on a more regular basis, but they still had the quiz to look forward to on a Wednesday lunchtime. Then his mind was seemingly as sharp as ever on dates and events of decades gone by. With her knowledge of recent current affairs, they made a good team, and she ensured that her lunch hour coincided with the time of the quiz. They would drink tea together. Teddy drank nothing but tea now. She could see him getting thinner as the weeks went by, but his eyes were still sharp even if his appetite wasn't. He still never talked about his past much, and to why he had ended up as a DFL, down from London resident, only that his life had been full of adventure, danger and colour. Sarah was happy with that. She was happy about pretty much everything. She rose from her bed with a little tune coming into her head. It was funny sometimes how she woke up with some song or other coming to the surface upon waking. This particular one she had heard Teddy hum to himself yesterday. It was only a few bars, but she had recognised the tune. On her way home she looked it up on her phone, smiled to herself, and then probably forgot about it. Now, within minutes of waking, Mull of Kintyre was in full swing inside her head. She began to run her shower and took a quick peek at the weather outside. No mist rolling in from the sea, she thought to herself. But the sunshine promised a lovely morning. After showering and dressing quickly, it was porridge for breakfast. Her beloved mother's habit was hard to break, and she had no lunch to make today. It was Wednesday, and it was quiz day in the communal room. Sandwiches and cakes were supplied by the kitchen for all visitors and guests. There was always plenty left over for her to eat afterwards. The majority of the residents either had a family member visit or they teamed up together, but Sarah was Teddy's only ever teammate. They hadn't won the quiz yet, but had been a close second quite a few times. If Teddy was on form today, then this may be the day. It was only a box of chocolates which stood as first prize, but it wasn't the winning that was important. Teddy had been feeling down lately, and she knew that the dementia was starting to take hold. He had not told her anything about himself since they had known each other. She knew that he had been married, but for how long and when was a mystery. She also knew he had been in the army and maybe to the Middle East, but she wasn't sure. Sarah was very fond of him and almost treated him like a favourite grandparent. All of hers were long departed. Since those mornings after church service, they had talked about anything and everything except for his past. She knew she would be distraught when he passed away. After working at the home for a number of years, she had seen many residents decline quite rapidly. The advantage of working in a private specialist facility was the level of care that was at hand. Aside from the individual guest rooms where the doors were made to look like front doors with numbers and a fake letterbox, there was a mock pub complete with bar and pumps that squirted out squash. A pretend grocer's and post office stood next to the pub so that the residents could identify real shops. There, should they wish, they could purchase stamps, post letters and buy apples and bananas. It was all part of keeping reality in track. The idea of being in a care home scared a lot of the residents, but this gave them a sense of normality. There were 3 large rooms also. One was classed as a quiet lounge. No radio, no television, and certainly no noise. There was also the dining room, which Sarah thought was a little stuffy and reminded her of her school days, but the main focus of attention was the communal area. A large semicircle of chairs facing a music TV screen for film nights or soaps, and also for the games and activities. Occasionally there would be an entertainer who would visit and plough his way through the hits of yesteryear, or maybe some local schoolchildren would visit with their latest music production. All of this was to prevent boredom. Once that setting, it was a slippery road to deterioration. Sarah left her flat after a meticulous, careful checklist in ensuring all was safe. The home was on the other side of the harbour, so a brisk walk would get her there in 10 minutes. She was always early. It gave her a chance to catch up on everyone she looked after. She knew all of the residents by name, and they knew her. Teddy was sitting in his usual comfortable chair inside the sunny and well-lit communal lounge. The chair had a wooden frame and a light green cotton cover. An extra cushion was a recent addition to cater for the sag of the original, and a small tartan rug had been added at the back of the chair. Both of these were to hide the many stains from previous users of years gone by. Around this chair were many others of the same colour and design. They were facing towards a window out of which could be seen a well-tended garden. Some of these other chairs were occupied by men and women of a similar age, many of their bodies frail and wizened. It was usually the same people that gathered themselves into this same room every day. The conversation had long since dried out, and some dozed, enjoying the warmth of the sunlight coming in. The smell of the room emitted a sweetened odour of disinfectant and age. It was mid-morning, and all the residents had been woken, washed, dressed, and breakfasted by the other shift of devoted nurses. Some remained awake, but continued to stare into a void. In their mind they were simply at home with their fast-fading memories. Some had just given in to the effects of their condition. This home specialised in dementia care, a very exclusive and expensive club to belong to. It had withstood the local backlash of complaints when it first opened its doors 10 years previously, due to the fact that the building company that took it over had completely renovated what was the original local town hall. This magnificent building was situated on a very picturesque harbour. Most of the locals had protested and were looking for a cultural museum or maybe a modern fish restaurant. They had nothing against the older generation, just that they knew it would be an establishment well out of reach of their own budgets should they fall to that dreadful illness. There was no consideration for the effects of the disease for the poor occupants, only that it wouldn't bring any money into the town, and that a day trip of blabbering old people would also scare away any rich tourists looking to part with their money on tacky souvenirs or overpriced lobster tails. Local people were very fickle and very selfish. When Teddy first arrived, he was fortunate enough to be agile and only aware of the first stages. It was believed he had searched all over the United Kingdom for a suitable venue, and chose this because of the harbour and the tranquillity. There were vacancies. There were always vacancies due to the price of accommodation. A year in Barbados would have been cheaper than 3 months here. Money wasn't the issue for Teddy. Location, location, location. Now, who said that? He didn't know or remember, and quite frankly didn't care. When he had first arrived, it had instantly felt right. It was peaceful, scenic, and above all else, miles away from any city. He had looked around the communal room. Here they all were. Same seats, same faces, with just another day on the clock to live through. It reminded him of waiting for a train journey to reach its destination, and every mile represented a day. It was a journey no one could leave. Whether you enjoyed it or just sat and waited was up to you, unless, of course, you suffered from dementia and you were simply a passenger in your own body, strapped to your train seat, unable to do a damn thing about it. So here they all were, with no comment or expression, just the shallow rise and fall of the chest to confirm their existence. Music softly filtered from above and recalled a forgotten era of bands and melody. This was in direct competition with a television set showing exciting images of daytime viewing, but the sound was lowered to a volume hardly recognisable to its audience of chairs, starers and sleepers. The young nurse was circulating among the residents and with a reassuring smile checked that all was well amongst the chairs. Teddy knew her well. He was one of the few residents who knew only too well the daily routine of the room. He had his good days and his bad. Since arriving here, he had noted his own decline. His health initially was good enough to be able to explore the area and villages around him. It had pleased him immensely to feel at home so quickly and reminded him of younger days. Why that was escaped him now. He had begun to attend church on a Sunday morning. When did he first adopt the Christian faith? And the local chapel was just a short walk away from the home. He had met many interesting local people there. It felt good not to be judged. His only sin was a London accent, but his charm and the willingness to help out at the coffee and biscuits after service had won over the sceptics. Here he was a very dapper English gent on their doorstep, full of mystery. That had made him smile, and he wanted it to stay that way. He also got introduced to a Mrs. Pascoe and her daughter Sarah. The mother was fine, if a little too religious for his liking, but it was Sarah he was captivated by. He had never had any children of his own, but Sarah felt like the daughter that he should have had. Going to Sunday service now meant chatting with this girl afterwards, and he had looked forward so much to that. She never once inquired as to why he had ended up where he was. They had just talked about everything else. He found her to be a great ally in winning over the doubting Thomases of the village, and also got a lowdown on all the major goings-on. She had made him laugh, and on one particular Sunday she joyfully informed him that she had been given a position at the care home as a care assistant. This meant that he was able to see her during the week as well as the church get-together. Teddy was beside himself with joy with her news. He was astute enough to know that there would be a time when his outings would cease. At least this way his sanity would be preserved a little longer, all the while he had the mental capacity to converse. That was then. Now he was contemplating the thought of an early lunch, or whether it was too soon after the late breakfast. The thought was always about food now. Eating times are what carried the day along. His thoughts were still with food, even though an earlier stomach cramp had held him to his bed longer than usual this morning. The irony, that he was unaware of, was that every breakfast he had in recent times was left virtually untouched. Only his mind was telling them that he had feasted. A hearty breakfast, 2 half-chewed slices of toast, and 5 cups of tea had eased the nagging pain, but he hoped the nurse would be able to bring another cup shortly. He was once again beginning to feel thirsty and parched. His lips were dry and a slight crust of spittle had formed at the edges of his mouth. A few years ago Teddy would have found this aberration of basic cleanliness intolerable. Now he never noticed, hardly ever looked in a mirror. It had been some time since a glass of beer or whisky with a dash of water had passed his lips. That appeal had long since disappeared since, well, he was unable to recall now. What was that expression? Something about the Gobi Desert. The memory escaped him. He was unsure as to how many years he had been in here since his wife passed away. Although well looked after, he had noticed just how quickly the days had flicked away. Much like speed-reading a novel without taking in a detail or story. He was also starting to fear the vanishing memories that seemed to leave him overnight without a bye or leave. When did that start happening? More importantly, where was that cup of tea? Teddy began to smile as he heard the nurse approach. She had in her hand his 6th steaming hot drink so far. "Ah, good," he said to himself quietly. "It's in a mug. Can't bear those ridiculous cups and saucers." He felt a gentle and warm hand on his shoulder and smiled. "Hello, lovely," he said. "Hello, Teddy, my love," Sarah replied and placed the cup on the table by his chair. It was already occupied by the last beverage, now cold. "You are awake for this lovely tea I've made you, then?" Teddy turned his head towards the reassuring voice and smiled again with an intent full of affection. Her voice was full of care and warmth. His day always made better by her appearance. "So how are you this morning?" Sarah asked as she eyed him up from head to toe. "You seem a little peaky today. Have you not eaten breakfast again?" Teddy once again smiled and nodded his head slightly. "I'm okay," he replied, trying to sound reassuring. "Just a bit of indigestion is all. I've had it most of my life, you know. Something to put up with. Not the end of the world, though, is it?" Why had he lied to her? As far as he can recall, his life had been a healthy one. The life that he can bring to mind, at least. How ironic that he cannot remember when the memories had begun to fade. The photo frame that sits on top of his bedside cabinet in his apartment is now the only solid reminder he had. There was only one. The image was of a very elegant woman in a sparkling dress. She is sitting and wears the smile of someone who is happy in that moment of time. In the background are other tables full of similarly smart-dressed people. It must have been a special occasion, like a wedding. His wedding? He cannot be sure. She was very pretty. This damned disease. At least a photo doesn't record the good and the bad or the wrongs and the right. Mainly they are just headshots and static cheesy grins of those he assumes are long gone from this world. Now they are only to remain in faded ink. It saddened him and he found himself frowning. This had to stop now. These thoughts of remorse. He is happy here, isn't he? If only the nagging indigestion would ease. Maybe the tea will cure that. No need to ask the nice nurse for any tablets. If only he could remember her name. If only. He looked up and saw the nurse had bent down to face him at eye level. You okay, Teddy? You seem to have faded away from me there. Is everything all right? There is concern in her voice. A cup of your favourite here. Made it just for you. Come on now, let me sit you up a bit. Sarah takes him gently under each arm and lifts him slightly upright again. Is it her imagination, or does he feel lighter today? Thanks, Tar. I've been looking forward to my tea, said Teddy. You make it just how I like it, you know. I'm amazed how you remember. Sarah straightened up and put a hand on each hip. A slip of hair had come away from bending down and had fallen over one of her eyes. She gently blew upwards to remove it. Teddy had fallen in love with this girl. A fatherly love. A trusting adoration. Don't you worry about it, Teddy, she replied. We've known each other long enough now, you know. Here's your tea. Don't go drifting on me again, otherwise you'll be sitting there with a cold cup on you. Lunch menu will be round shortly. Sarah beamed at him as she placed the mug in his hands. Oh, don't forget, she continued as she began to walk away. I'm going to need your help in the quiz this afternoon. We make a good team, me and you, and if we can catch out that Mr. Harrison and his teammate Barbara, I think we might just win this week. Teddy listened to her walking away, heard her talking to all of the other occupied chairs. He looked down at his hands at the tea, just the way he liked it. Milky with 1 sugar. It was, wasn't it? The idea of a fun quiz made him feel a little better. The quizzes were always good fun in here. Something to keep his memory alive. How ridiculous that he can instantly recall the runner-up at Wimbledon's men's final in '76, but struggle to recall the village he was living in or what he had for dinner last night. Maybe, if a visitor would pop their head round the door of his apartment now and again, it might help him recall. But who would that be? Had he anyone related to him that was still alive? He wouldn't be able to talk over the events of the day. He had a television, set in his room, but that was hardly ever on. He didn't need it. He just felt so damn sleepy all the time. Taking the mug of tea and placing it to his dry lips, he resettled himself back into the chair, so indented with his body shape over the last few years. Funny how we always take the same seats, he thought to himself. He lowered the cup back to his lap and then winced. No, there it is. That blasted pain again. He carefully lowered the cup down onto the armrest and kept it steady while he waited for the ache to ease. If I just breathe slowly, it will pass, he thought silently. He cursed himself for not asking the nurse for a tablet to ease the indigestion when she was here a few moments ago. His frustration now turned to shock as he felt a warm sensation on his waist. Spilt my bloody tea now. He looked down at the damp patch on his lap and trouser fly. The cup was still almost full, yet the liquid warmth was still spreading. Now his annoyance turned to shame. It wasn't just the tea from the mug. He had wet himself. For the first time since he was a child, his bladder had let go on him. Before he contemplated any other regret, the pain hit him again in his stomach. A panic now started to set in. This was like no indigestion he had ever experienced before. He needed to breathe slowly now. His head remained still, but his eyes darted manically back and forth from left to right. All around him, life here was carrying on as before. There was no one rushing to his aid. No one even looking in his direction. As far as he was aware, time had stopped still. Only the cheesy music continued and the images on the TV flickered. What was happening? If I just breathe slowly, Teddy repeated to himself. If I just... The hand remained still, but the body stiffened as sharp and as quick as a lightning bolt. 2 fingers straightened and adjusted the balance of the cup, which now gently slid from the fingers and began its descent onto the worn carpet beneath. Twisting slightly, the mug paused as if by magic, suspended in mid-air. A fraction of a second. Chapter 2. The Courtroom. The room itself was relatively small. Unlike the dramatic city images of Hollywood films oozing pictures of polished oak and decades of sweat and fear soaked into the wood, this particular room was almost a sad contradiction. It was very grey. There were no pictures or paintings of any kind on the walls. There were also no windows or natural light. Everything was lit by sterile-looking strip lights. Such was the positioning of the lighting, there were no shadows. At the end of the room on one side laid a raised platform. Behind this there were 3 chairs, and on these chairs sat 3 people. The man in the middle could be described as a judge of sorts. There were no robes or gowns that distinguished this. He was dressed as though on a day at the office. Much like many TV talent shows, he was accompanied by a smaller man to his left and a woman of similar age to his right. Both were also dressed in business attire. All 3 wore spectacles as though it was part of the uniform. No one smiled or talked. They all sat and waited patiently. All faced towards 2 other tables on the opposite side. These tables were also occupied by a smartly dressed man who were faced towards the opposite. Both tables piled with differently coloured file boxes. Although both of these men are virtually identical, there were clear signs of rivalry. Mr. Lewis looked over to his colleague Mr. Connor, who gave him a nod. To both men this was a game of wits, the aim of being simply to extract the truth as quickly as possible. Mr. Lewis was the younger of the 2, his hair slicked back and shiny with the reflection from the artificial lighting. Connor had come dressed in a smart 3-piece grey, very classic. His face was clean-shaven that morning and was lacquered with a designer cologne, which could be smelt from over a metre away. Connor had never married. He preferred the casual relationship and was devoted to his job. He felt he had been given this role of leading lawyer today because of his ability to be fair. He looked over towards Mr. Lewis. They had been in competition before, many times. His colleague was the more relaxed of the 2. Dressed in a dark 2-piece, the trademark of Mr. Lewis was his stark white designer trainers. He had always maintained that, due to abnormally wide feet, he had to wear more comfortable footwear. Mr. Connor knew this was a lie. The trainers were almost a fashion statement, and he guessed that his colleague was simply trying too hard to establish some kind of identity. He sported a well-kept beard, and his thick band of gold worn on his wedding finger was apparent for all to see. This man opposite him was serious, but Connor never felt intimidated. The decision could go either way. Both were here to aid the judge, but at the same time, both felt it would be their questions that would win over. There was no jury, no members of the public. This was not a Crown Court. Both only had to interview the witnesses, and once all the evidence was complete, then and only then would the judge give the final verdict. A life will hang in the balance. Each man will want to ensure the correct decision is made. On one side, placed between the opposing tables, was a small plinth. Big enough for a chair behind, but this is really classed as a witness stand. No one will have to be sworn in, but the truth must always be given. All interviews conducted here will be carefully monitored. A small glass of water had been placed on the stand. Still nobody spoke. There was an edge to the atmosphere. All eyes in the room looked to the judge. He gently removed his glasses and held them dangling in his left hand, while the other hand carefully massaged the bridge of his nose. He knows it is another day of listening. To him, this day is like every other. There will be events and accounts told here that will need to be ascertained as to whether the truth was being spoken or that the story will be a deception. He knows that is what both Mr. Lewis and Mr. Connor are here for. His decision will be final, as always, but the two gentlemen in front of him are experts in their field. Quite a responsibility, but he is always sure which way to swing on this particular pendulum. It is time to start. Replacing his glasses, he cleared his throat and began. Lady and gentlemen of the court. He spared a look for each person in the room. They all stopped to turn and look at him. This was his power play. Nothing can proceed without his say-so, and it gives him a small thrill into what is going to be just another case in another tedious day. Are we ready to proceed? With this, both men on the opposing side nodded their heads. The judge acknowledged the agreement. Very well, let us begin, please. Mr. Connor, you are to start, and Mr. Lewis will aid you. Can I ask you both to confirm this to the court? A small nod from each of you will suffice. He looked over, and again both men gave him a nod. He took a deep breath. Good. Thank you, gentlemen. Please let the record show that this court is now in session. We have, I am sure, a lot to get through. Now, Mr. Connor? He looked over to the younger of the two, instantly rose up from his chair on hearing his name. Yes, Your Honour, said Connor quietly. The judge looked him straight in the eye. He had presided over these two men before on many occasions. The young man always had a determined look and persona. In reference to the first witness, can I assume that you have the usual statement from the boy's solicitor which has been verified? The judge watched Mr. Connor carefully. Yes, sir, said Mr. Connor clearly. I do. Mr. Lewis, can I confirm that you have seen the statement and are happy with the content? He looked over to see Mr. Lewis also stand. I am, sir, came the reply. And are both of you agreed that no physical presence is required for this section? Both men answered in a well-practised yes. The first witness in these cases was usually too young to attend court by law. A statement had been made previously, and to save time had been looked over and agreed by both parties before coming to court. Excellent, said the judge with a small smile. If only all our time here was as easy as that. He watched as both men expressed a polite laugh. He knew that they had heard this joke many times, but he didn't care. This was his courtroom, and he was ultimately in charge of all proceedings. Just because there was no jury or public gallery to perform to, didn't mean he couldn't create a light atmosphere. In that case, then, Mr. Connor, for the benefit of the court, would you kindly read out the prepared statement? Connor moved away from his seat and took hold of the carefully prepared A4 sheet of paper that lay on his desk on the top of his documents. He gave a brief look round to all to check all were paying attention, and he cleared his throat. This then is the statement as verified from the child, who I shall refer to simply as Edward. This statement was taken recently and was witnessed by an independent authority. Both my learned colleague Mr. Lewis and myself have read through it and have both agreed on the contents of the account as follows. Mr. Connor paused to raise his head to the main table. In a funny sort of way, he wanted to ensure that everyone was listening. This was his starting monologue, and he was buggered if he had to start again because someone wasn't concentrating. Although a difficult pregnancy, Edward was born in good time, without complication and an average weight for a new baby. His parents were Ruth and John Darget. They were married after hearing the news that she was pregnant and wanted to do the right thing. Both were in their early 20s when the registry office was arranged. It was a small affair with both sets of parents to act as witnesses. A local pub provided the reception with a few sandwiches, and by the late afternoon they were back to their rented house next to the local laundrette. There were no regrets. Both of them were in love and were prepared for parenthood. John had a good job as a coalman delivering locally, and Ruth was able to help out with a few shifts next door with the washing machines while keeping Edward in his pram. Mr. Connor again raised his head and licked his lips. All was silent in the courtroom. He continued. During the child's first few years, there were no reported signs of neglect, abuse, or malnutrition. His first days of nursery and preschool were uneventful, and there was a record of popularity amongst his friends there and of the teaching staff. Life at home seemed good and loving. To summarise then, the first 6 years of life were to prove uneventful, with no complication, and therefore no discussion is necessary up to this point. Thank goodness for that, Mr. Connor, interrupted the judge. Seems we could be here all day on this. What is your point? Just to give you a perspective and background, Your Honour, replied Connor. We both felt it was important. Please then do continue, said the judge, nodding to both of his companions. Thank you, sir. So, this brings us to an incident at the age of 7 years and 3 months, in which involved the stealing of a packet of crisps and a small chocolate bar from the boy's local newspaper convenience store. The reason for the boy doing this is unclear, as no other incidents had been recorded up to this point in his life. His family had never been overly rich, but there was always food and warmth, particularly from the odd pieces of coal that happened to fall off the delivery bags on the back of his father's lorry. A tradesman's perk, I believe that is referred to. Mr. Connor allowed himself a wry smile. However, it has come to our attention that after hurriedly eating the crisps on his way back to his home a few streets away, a small, sharp section of potato crisp became lodged in the throat of the boy. A panic occurred in his mind, and the chocolate bar was quickly eaten and swallowed, which resulted in the offending slither to become unlodged in his young throat and digested properly. It has since been decided that, both items having been stolen without payment, the chocolate bar did seem to save the boy's life, and that this incident should go down as a minor happening. Connor heard the exasperated puff of air from the judge. Is there a problem, Your Honour? He asked. The judge took off his glasses and again rubbed the bridge of his nose. There was a tiny indentation and a small red mark on either side. Good Lord, Mr. Connor, complained the judge. What on earth is the point of all of this so far? The statement has been detailed, sir, to allow depth. I realise it is only a very minor occurrence, but why then, interrupted the judge, is this incident contained within the record? It was in our opinion, Your Honour, that this was included to simply begin an outline of what is essentially a mild, almost unblemished record. I'm not sure of your point, Mr. Connor. I realise some of the cases we deal with are mundane to a point, but this... Let's hope this is not going to be one of those. Please continue. The judge waved his hand casually towards the defence lawyer, as if to bat him away. Thank you, sir. Since that incident, the child continued to gain knowledge and become a very studious pupil at school and a quiet, self-contained boy at home. There were some weekend holidays taken between the ages of 8 and 9, but these were simply family weekend breaks in various regional overnight guest houses in seaside locations. Thank goodness, said the judge, and smiled sarcastically. This, though, Your Honour, continued Mr. Connor, brings me to the one outstanding incident as a matter of concern. This occurred at the last holiday week before returning to the boy's autumn term, aged 9. And what was this incident then, Mr. Connor? Another chocolate bar? The judge smiled at his own humour. Mr. Connor stared back at him and his face hardened. No, Your Honour. This young boy was witness to a brutal murder.